We're outside the old home of 19th century Ontario legislator George Brown. Brown was a founder of the Globe newspaper, a precursor to today's Globe and Mail. He was also a major force against slavery, as well as a Confederation-era politician and a major proponent for church-state separation. Concerned by the power of the Catholic Church, he fought hard to prevent government and taxpayer support for the Roman Catholic denominational schools, but he of course lost as part of the compromise deemed necessary to enable confederation. Now at the time, at least you could claim that Catholics paid for their Catholic educational system. But as Think Again TV investigates, that is no longer at all the case. We're going to interview Reva Landau, who's filed a notice of application with the Ontario courts in order to undo the unconstitutional growth in government support for religion in Ontario. And as we'll see, George Brown would hardly recognize the current state of taxpayer-funded Catholic schools in Ontario.
Think Again TV is produced by Centre for Inquiry, Canada's premier venue for secular humanists, atheists, skeptics, and free thinkers.
Hi there, I'm Justin Trottier with Think Again TV. Today we speak with Reva Landau, a non-practicing lawyer, but more to the point, a citizen concerned by the current overreach of the Catholic publicly funded school system in Ontario. Reva submitted a notice of application to the Ontario Superior Court and the Attorney General of the Province of Ontario. Her position? That the public support and funding currently afforded to the Catholic school system should be rolled back to no more than the minimum provision guaranteed by the 1867 Constitution. Now, in 1867, when the Constitution, or the British North America Act, came into force, the funds for supporting the Catholic school system came not completely, but essentially from Catholic taxpayers. So it was true at the time, almost, that Catholics paid for Catholic schools. Reva, is that still true?
No, it's not still true. Because of the changes made to the Ontario Education Act, only about 6% of the revenues available to all Catholic schools come from people who've called themselves Catholic school supporters.
6%?
Roughly,
wow,
6%.
Okay.
About 80% come from the provincial government, and about another 10% come from business taxes. Okay. Now, public school supporters roughly double, about 12% of the funding available to them comes from people who call themselves public school supporters. So it's obvious when you do the math that people who are public school supporters are in fact funding separate schools.
Well, we often hear that whatever you tick off on your property tax form, that's where your funds go. So the mantra out there is, you know, Catholics pay for Catholic schools, everybody else pays for the public schools. You're saying that is a false impression.
That is a false impression. It's true that if you tick off Catholic, your money goes to the Catholic separate school system. And if you tick off public, the money goes to the public school system. But that's a small 6 to 12% of the money available to those schools. Most of the money comes from the central government, comes from general revenues. It comes from the money people pay in sales taxes or income tax or any other kind of tax there is. And because more of that money per student goes to the Catholic school system than the public school system, it's obvious that people who are not Catholics must be supporting the Catholic school system. That's even aside from the fact that if you're atheist or Buddhist or Muslim or whatever, you have to pay taxes to support a public school system. And if you want to send your child to a faith-based school or an atheist school or a Montessori school or whatever, you have to pay that full funding. I guess you could raise three issues. One is the percentage of funding they should get, which I'm arguing in 1867 all they got was 60 to 65%, so that's all they should get now. Secondly, whether they should get funding for grades 9 and 10, for which there was some funding in 1867, but my argument would be that as Charter of Rights should be interpreted broadly, any exceptions should be interpreted narrowly. So if there are any exceptions that are cutting down on equality for anybody, they should lean towards interpreting them narrowly rather than broadly. And thirdly, grades 11 and 12, for which I would argue there was no funding for separate schools for what would be considered the equivalent of grades 11 and 12 in 1867.
And your second point, I think, is really key, because the spirit, if not the letter of the charter, is definitely violated by having special rights, in this case special funding for Catholic schools, Catholic communities. But the problem is the Ontario Human Rights Commission and other bodies that would otherwise deem that discriminatory is told to keep their hands off, because it is provided in the 1867 Constitution. But what you're saying is that the charter is in a sense, morally at least, a more important document. So if there are areas where the charter is being violated in spirit, then that violation should be minimized as much as we possibly can.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons they gave for why they didn't want to touch the section is they said it was part of the great compromise of confederation, that Protestants in Quebec were agreed they could have separate schools, and Catholics in Ontario, which was then Canada West or
Right.
Upper Canada, could have separate schools. Well, in 1997, actually a couple of years earlier, but the National Assembly in Quebec passed a law in the mid-1990s saying we do not want Section 93 to apply to our province at all. We want nothing to do with it. And that was passed as an amendment to the Constitution in 1997.
How contentious was that at the time when it was passed by the National Assembly in Quebec?
There were people in Quebec who opposed it, but to give the members of the National Assembly of Quebec credit, they said this is the right thing to do, and we're going ahead and doing it, even if there are people who object. I give them credit for having the courage and the integrity to do that.
The Ontario-Quebec political dynamic, the two provinces always kind of watching each other closely, is very interesting. Can you go into a bit more detail about the political context in Quebec that led the National Assembly to make this decision?
I think what they wanted to do was reorganize the public school system, or rather organize the publicly funded school system along linguistic grounds rather than religious grounds. So what happened was the National Assembly unanimously passed a resolution basically saying include us out of Section 93. We don't
does not apply to Quebec, or
it does not. That's exactly what it says. Yeah. Section 93 does not apply to Quebec. And it was passed by the government, and became a constitutional amendment to the Constitution of Canada in 1997. So since 1997...
And sorry, was it a close vote in the National Assembly?
It was unanimous.
Unanimous in favor of the amendment? In favor
of the amendment. And in 1997, it became part of the Constitution of Canada. Mm-hmm. And since then, the public school system in Quebec has been organized along linguistic grounds,
right.
French-English, rather than religious. So here we have two Supreme Court decisions which go on and on about the Great Compromise in 1867 and how it was necessary for Confederation. And meanwhile, the other half of the Great Compromise has said, include us out. And I give them credit for it. I think it's the right attitude.
Right. When you say the other half, I think we should also remember that there were other provinces, and shortly after 1867, when yet more provinces started to join the Confederation. For example, Manitoba. Didn't Manitoba briefly flirt with the idea of having their own Catholic protected school board, but very quickly they put in their own amendment to their agreement that rescinded those rights?
There have been other provinces. When Newfoundland joined, it had a separate school system, or rather it had a denominational school system. Mm-hmm. And they also passed a constitutional amendment saying we don't want anything to do with this. And by the way, Newfoundland is mostly Catholic, right, as is Quebec, so it's not an anti-Catholic thing.
So this has happened in a number of provinces, and I think a lot of people think that it would take something like a federal provincial assembly, that all the provinces would have to agree because it seems like the Constitution's changing, but actually it seems like in the case of Quebec or Manitoba or Newfoundland, it's just the province itself that, because education is provincial, I mean, does the federal government, can it veto the province's decision?
It could refuse to pass it, but it's never done that.
Right.
What it's always said is if the representatives of the province say they don't want these sections to apply to them anymore, they'll go along with them. They're not going to overrule them.
Do you see what you're doing with this notice of application to the Ontario courts? Do you see this as the first step? I mean, are you ultimately hoping it'll lead to a total reevaluation of the system?
That would be great if it happened, but there's the difference between the legal and political.
Yeah.
So I'm saying legally, it seems to me all I can do is force them to limit it to what was there in 1867. That's the most I can do. Politically, there's nothing to prevent Ontario passing the same resolutions that Quebec passed and Newfoundland passed and Manitoba was in and out passed.
Right.
But I can't make them do that legally.
We've been talking a lot about the funding, the limits on funding, that they should obey what the funding promise was in 1867 and not the additions that they've made since. Are there, besides funding, are there other ways in which the Catholic system over the last 130 or so years, maybe a bit more than that, has actually expanded their kind of jurisdiction within the school in ways that maybe wasn't originally guaranteed, that should also be rolled back?
They always had control, I think, over teachers and what they could teach in the school.
Hiring and firing at their pleasure.
And things like that. So it's more that there are now way more people going to Catholic schools. In 1867, only about a quarter of all Catholic students, not students, Catholic students, went to separate schools. The rest of them went to public schools.
Really?
Yes, because people thought there were advantages in going to the public schools. There were advantages to them in mixing with all the other students. And also because they weren't funded as well as public schools, parents wanted them to go to the system where they got the best funding. They had the most books. They had better facilities. Mm-hmm. So what has happened is as the funding has increased over the years, more and more Catholic students have been going into the separate school system. So now, I think just under 30% of all students in Ontario go to the separate school system.
Right.
So basically, our taxes are going to support a sectarian system, which has a number of points of view of which I think some people might disagree. For example, the separate school system can legally discriminate in favor of Catholic teachers. Two teachers come to them, they can legally say, we prefer this teacher because they are Catholic and the other one is not Catholic.
Right.
So if you're a non-Catholic teacher, you can get hired in the public school system, but you have less of a chance of being hired in the separate school system, which after all has about 30% of the students. And I don't know if you know what the situation is like for teachers now in Ontario, but it's not great.
It's a challenge to get a job.
It's a challenge. On the other hand, if you're a Catholic teacher, you have an equal right, as much as anybody else, to be hired in the public, I'll call it the non-sectarian system, because they're both public,
yes.
Well, they're not public in the philosophical sense, but they're public in the funded sense. In the funded sense, exactly. So a Catholic teacher has a right to be hired in the non-sectarian publicly funded system, as they should be, and they can also be hired in the publicly funded Catholic system.
Right.
So I am as a non-Catholic, I'm supporting a system that discriminates against people of my group.
So you bring up the fact that you as a non-Catholic are supporting. Let's talk more about you, Reva, if that's okay.
Yeah.
We should have probably introduced you in the beginning.
Yeah.
But now that you've obviously demonstrated a thorough and deep understanding of the situation all the way back to Confederation, I mean, why is that? Are you just sort of self-taught, or do you have a legal background that introduced you to the topic?
I'm a non-practicing lawyer.
Okay.
So I graduated from law school, and I pay fees to the Law Society of Upper Canada, but I don't practice as a lawyer. Okay. So I have some legal background. Secondly, just on the face of it, if you know we have a Charter of Rights, it just seems on the face of it discriminatory to have a publicly funded Catholic system and nobody else, atheists, humanitarians, Buddhists, Protestants, members of the Anglican Church, can be funded at all. That just seems discriminatory. And in 2007, John Tory, who was then the head of the Conservative Ontario Party, came out with an idea for faith-based funding, so that faith-based schools could also get funding. Now, that isn't the solution I support, but I give him credit for at least trying to be consistent.
Right.
In other words, saying, if Catholics can get this funding, why shouldn't other people? And McGuinty at the time, who was the Premier and still is the Premier of Ontario, made all these speeches about how wonderful diversity was and how great it was to have a public school system in which Protestants and Jews and Buddhists and atheists and everybody all sit together in the same classroom.
Yeah.
And I thought, those are really good speeches, but he doesn't seem to listen to them. Because if he listened to his own speeches, he would stop funding for Catholic separate schools. If it's good for Protestants and Buddhists and atheists to all sit together in the same classroom, why isn't it good for Catholics to sit together in the same classroom with them? And that really started me thinking a lot more about it and investigating, how did we get into this mess? For example, the United Nations, a number of years ago, somebody brought a complaint to the UNESCO Committee of the United Nations saying Ontario's school laws discriminated contrary to the charter to which Canada is a signatory in the United Nations, saying there should be no...
The Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Right, that's right. There should be no discrimination on account of religion.
Yeah.
And they said our whole school system contradicts that. Now, unfortunately, that isn't legally binding on the Supreme Court of Canada. It's kind of interest. It's like if the U.S. government says anything. They will look at that because it's of interest, but it's not binding on them. So it's not binding on them.
But was it actually looked at? In the sense, did the government ever issue a response to the UN condemnation?
No, they just ignored it and hoped it would go away, which I suppose in a way it did. I mean, because the federal government said it was provincial and they couldn't do anything about it, and the provincial government simply didn't respond. And as I said, it's not binding.
Right.
It's not like you can pass a law making them do it, but it tells you something about, we like to think of Canada as sort of a beacon of light, right, to all these unenlightened countries who don't have equality.
Well, we also like to think of Canada as progressive, not as hung up on the law as it was, you know, over 100 years ago. And you look at the United Nations Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which I understand was actually used in the framing of our own Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It was part of, you know, one of the legal traditions that was there internationally that we based our charter on. Those charters, I mean, as a country, we've progressed towards equality, towards diversity. Why do we keep obsessing over something that was put in place in 1867? It's in the Constitution, but as we've discussed in this interview, that hasn't stopped other provinces from moving along in the same tradition of progress. That's a tradition too. So Reva, if people are as frustrated by the status quo as I assume you are, that motivated your interest in this, what would you have them do?
I think they should call their local member of provincial parliament and say, we want you to pass a bill, as Quebec did, as Newfoundland did, saying that Section 93 no longer applies to us, and that there should only be one publicly funded school system in Ontario. That would be the ideal. If that's what people really care about, that's what they should do.
Great. Well, I appreciate the effort you're putting into this cause. I know it takes a lot of courage and a lot of time, so thank you, and thank you for being on Think Again TV.
Think Again TV is produced by Centre for Inquiry, Canada's premier venue for secular humanists, atheists, skeptics, and free thinkers.
CFI Canada coordinates branches and campus groups across the country, runs a public education series, provides secular community services, incorporates cutting-edge multimedia such as blogs, podcasts, and YouTube, and is a regular voice in the press presenting a secular humanist, atheist, and skeptical perspective.